Today, I am pleased to welcome Kal Dosanjh to the Coastal Front studio. Kal is CEO of KidsPlay Foundation, an active member of the Vancouver Police Department, and most importantly, a proud father. With over 20 years of law enforcement experience, Kal first served 15 years as a patrol officer before becoming detective. Mr. Dosanjh worked in one of the most challenging and violent environments in North America in what is known as the Vancouver Downtown Eastside, where he was one of 15 officers as part of the beat enforcement team. Kal's service as law enforcement has led him to focus on providing youth with constructive outlets through sports. In 2015, Kal founded KidsPlay Foundation. Under his leadership, KidsPlay has had over 500 volunteers and over 70,000 youth participants take part in their programs since its inception. Today we're going to be discussing the Downtown Eastside, the school Liaison program, gangs, organized crime, and a variety of other topics, and tying this all back into KidsPlay Foundation. Kal, thanks for being on Coastal Front today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, great. Well, for the listeners and viewers to understand a little bit more about yourself before we dive into these topics, maybe just open up a little bit more about Kal Dosanjh. Who are you, and what makes you such a neat guy?
Well, neat is such a subjective term. But essentially, when I was finishing university, I was always fascinated by the adversarial nature of the criminal justice system. And law enforcement was just one of the many sides of the coins of what I was interested in. And my pursuit initially was going to law school. And so I was in the process of prepping for my LSAT and getting ready for that. And I was just coming into my fourth year at university. And an opportunity presented itself. The opportunity was the RCMP Summer Student Constable Program. So essentially what it did, it was a 2-month crash course where they take their selected candidates. It was quite a lengthy application process. They take their selected candidates, which were essentially university students, and they wanted to give exposure to these students about what policing is all about. It was part of their recruitment selection process. And so I thought, you know what, this would be a fascinating insight into what the policing world is all about, because had I even gone to law school, I was more interested in the prosecutorial side of things as part of Crown. And so this opportunity presented, I'm like, okay, I applied, I made it, and it was a crash course where over the course of 2 months, they basically gave you a whole bunch of legal training. It was metaphorically the equivalent of drinking water through a fire hose. And so you learn all that, and then on top of that, they teach you basic combat skills. I already had a background in kickboxing, so I was very adept at the martial arts side of things. But tactical skills on the street, handcuffing, how to deal with situations that you might come across. They put you through some scenarios, and they're like, pat on the back, here's a uniform, here's some handcuffs, a flashlight, away you go. So they put you on the street with a senior officer who is considered a field trainer officer, and I spent 2 months on the road in Surrey, and this was back in '97.
Okay.
And so I patrolled different parts of Surrey, so that included Guildford, South Surrey, Newton, just some of the areas. And it was an absolutely invaluable and insightful experience, so much so that essentially that was the catalyst that precipitated my trajectory and determined that someday, you know what, this is what I want to do. It was,
wow,
as cheesy as it sounds, I mean, it was virtually a call of duty.
Really?
Where I just realized, okay, this is it.
Yeah.
Like this is what I need to be doing. And so,
how old were you been at the time, probably?
I think I was 20 at the time.
Okay.
And so as soon as I finished my last year of university, I applied to VPD, and I got in, and never looked back. But wow, I'm telling you, man, it was it was baptism by fire.
Really?
Where it was sink or swim, and I came from a very insulated background, which was primarily sports and academics, raised in a very positive, constructive environment, where parents were always strongly promoting and encouraging being engaged with the community, because I grew up in a very traditional Sikh family.
Yeah.
So one of the primary tenets and fundamental principles of Sikhism is seva. And seva literally translated means to serve. Unconditional service.
Right.
And so for me, I grew up with that mentality. And so policing, in its essence, is a form of service.
Yeah.
And so it was just a natural gravitation for me to head in that direction. But it has been quite the ride.
And so you joined the Vancouver Police Department, and you basically, like you said, you've never looked back. You served 15 years in patrol and then have moved into a detective role. For us outsiders that don't maybe understand the policing world, what is the big difference between being a patrol officer versus a detective?
You know what? At the end of the day, not much, except it becomes a specialty. Because I always tell even all the new officers that are coming onto the job is learn the fundamentals first. Learn the mechanics of the job. And by mechanics, what I mean is that it's when you do patrol, that is the bread and butter of policing. So you're learning tactical skills. You're learning how to interact with the general public. You're learning fundamental investigative skills. You're learning operational skills. There are so many skills that you acquire in patrol. So a typical day in the downtown Eastside when I was acting sergeant is, especially on a Friday, Saturday, at some points in time, I'd be running multiple calls, multiple major calls, where you had a man with a gun, where you had a stabbing, all of this in progress at the same time simultaneously. And so you have to be adept and capable of dealing with something like that, and that only comes with experience and knowledge. And that experience and knowledge only comes with time. Mm-hmm. And so you need to invest at that fundamental level in policing. And it's from there that you acquire these fundamental skills that you can subsequently transition into other aspects of the job, such as becoming a detective. So all the detective investigative skills that I learned was in patrol, and it's just amplified when you go into an investigative division.
That makes sense. Well, I'm really excited to explore with some veteran in the VPD some of these various topics we're going to discuss with you, because you obviously have such a wealth of experience and street knowledge. I'm going to start with the Vancouver Police Liaison program. So this was a big piece of our now Mayor Ken Sim and the ABC party. It was one of their things that they said they're going to bring this back. They're going to bring back the Vancouver Police Liaison program that was removed under the former administration under Kennedy Stewart. So for those listeners who aren't familiar with it, can you first explain in sort of layman's terms, what is the Vancouver Police Liaison program? And do you believe in it? Do you like it? Do you support it? Do you think it's good for our community? Do you think it's good for our youth and our schools?
So specifically, you're referring to the School Liaison Officer Program, which is the SLO program.
Okay.
And the
That's what it's called, School Liaison Program?
School Liaison Officer Program.
Officer Program.
The SLO program. Okay. And so the SLO program, absolutely, I firmly believe in it.
Okay.
Because, I mean, obviously later on in this dialogue and conversation, we're going to get into one of the main reasons why I started KidsPlay. But you have to keep in mind is that with kids that were coming into the downtown Eastside, and I'll just use this as context, kids that were coming into downtown Eastside, they never had positive interaction with police.
Right.
They grew up in very toxic, dysfunctional environments for the most part, where it was always negative interaction with law enforcement officers. And so they always had these stereotypes that they would possess, and it was very difficult to shake that off and tell them, explain to them, that we're actually the good guys. We're here to provide you the resources and the support that you need to become successful in life. But unfortunately, if they were committing crimes, we were arresting them, pushing them through the criminal justice system. They'd be thrown into the youth detention center and spewed back onto the streets to re-engage in a perpetual cycle of violence. And we'd be at it again, arresting them again. So of course, there was going to be that negative interaction. But why let it get to that point in the first place? And so with a program like the School Liaison Officer, you have actual officers that are specifically designated to select schools to operate within that school. That is their purview, that's their job mandate, and that is their focus. And so they're essentially working in those respective schools, establishing rapport with these kids, getting to know them, because I can tell you the best way to prevent a kid from getting into a lifestyle is not to be reactive about it and deal with the situation after it's been done.
Yeah,
it's to be proactive about it, build that rapport, so should that child be heading down that slippery slope or that path, that you're able to prevent them from going down that path in the first place. That comes through relationship building. And then secondly, more importantly, is that should a situation happen in school, the officer is familiar with all the characters in the school. He's familiar with the dynamics. He's familiar with that subculture, that context, and they're able to deal with it in an adequate way and identify the culprits relatively quickly, and perhaps even diffuse it in a situation that doesn't require the criminal justice system to get involved.
Right.
So there's intervention that can be done at multiple levels. And so in that respect, an SL program is absolutely invaluable. And the majority of the kids were in support of it, because a lot of them that might have been heading down the wrong path were able to establish a rapport and a positive relationship with that officer, which inspired them to stay on the right path.
Right.
And you can't put a monetary value on that.
No.
It is unbelievable if you can have that level of substantive impact on a child's life.
Now, to be a devil's advocate, I'm not, and I myself personally support it as well. So I'm not speaking as a question as though I don't agree with it. But just to, if I was to put myself in the shoes of, say, Kennedy Stewart or one of these city councillors who were, actually it was the Vancouver School Board trustees who removed that program in the last administration, they would take the position, well, you know, there's this negative connotation between a lot of youth and police. Removing them from that environment is because the police had some kind of created trauma for these young kids at these high schools. I'm a big believer in data. Being a financial person, I just believe follow the numbers. And we did see a window where the SLO was removed here in Vancouver. Did we see any shift in what was going on with, let's say, gangs successfully recruiting kids during that short window in which, or was there any data that we can speak about that says, yeah, you know what, that there's a positive correlation between having liaison officers in the schools and this negative effect that goes down because they're there?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have any hard metrics in front of me, but I can tell you for a high level of certainty that there would be a statistical correlation between removing the police SLO officers from this program. Like, it doesn't take an academic leap to realize that when these officers have had such a substantive impact on these kids over a long period of time, and all of a sudden you take them out of that environment, what essentially is going to be left at the end of the day, it becomes relatively obvious.
Yeah.
And so, sure, it's going to leave a void, a gap, a vacuum, which is going to essentially facilitate that negative element seeping in. And so in that respect, I think it was absolutely imperative that we kept the officers there. And if we were to break down the metrics and take a look at the numbers, I'm sure that there would be hard empirical data which would show that, yeah, I don't think that was such a good idea.
Yeah. Are there SLO programs in other major municipalities? Like, for example, you mentioned you did a lot of work early on in Surrey. It's the fastest growing municipality. It's going to be bigger than Vancouver by population in the next few years.
Yep.
Do they have these types of programs in other municipalities?
Unfortunately, they don't.
They don't.
And the Surrey RCMP has very limited resources. Got a lot of friends and family that are with the Surrey RCMP, and they're doing an absolutely fantastic job with the resources that they do have.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they're providing great level of service, but in the same vein, there's limited number of resources. And so with VPD, I think we're fortunate enough that we do have the number of officers that we can disseminate and reallocate resources into these schools as the SLO program.
Yeah, okay. Sticking to the theme of sort of municipal decision-making, again, under Kennedy Stewart and the former administration, they basically, in a sense, defunded the police, the Vancouver Police Department, by not granting the police department its sort of increase in the allocation of the budget in, I think it was like 2020 or 2021. They had to go to the provincial government and sort of took it to court, I guess, so to speak, and they won, and they managed to get that $5 million back. And now Ken Sim and the ABC party have come in, and they're going beyond that. I think they're actually infusing another $5 million. Of course, one of the campaign promises of Mayor Sim was to, in his first 100 days, was to hire 100 public health nurses as well as 100 new police officers. If you look at after the George Floyd incident, there was a big push around North America for this sort of defund the police. What is your feeling at this time around that movement? And I gotta assume that you're not in favor of defunding the police, since you been involved in law enforcement since you were in university. Do you have a take on this? Do you want to maybe make some comments?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I mean, it was tremendously heartbreaking when we go from public heroes that are out there doing good work to being demonized. in the general public perception. And so sometimes it comes down to optics and perception, where granted there might have been a handful of officers specifically involved in that George Floyd case. If you were to talk to any other officers that might have viewed that video or taken a look at the tactical strategies that were deployed during that particular situation, the majority of officers would express concern, say, you know what, that's not how we're trained, and perhaps that's not how it should have been done. I'm not going to be an armchair quarterback and make comments sitting from here, but in the same vein, you got to keep in mind that the majority of police officers are individuals that are remarkably responsible and accountable to the general public, and we would rather diffuse a situation verbally than having to deal with a situation physically. But when the physical element requires for it, we are put in a very tight spot. If a general member of the public was to put themselves in our spot when we have split seconds to make a decision in a very violent confrontation, you got to keep in mind we've received specific training where we have to make these decisions in a manner that is accountable to the general public, follows the Police Act, which is essentially the legislation which dictates and governs us. And we have to think about all these things before we take that step.
Yeah.
In the same vein, simultaneously putting our lives at risk, which is part of the job and completely understandable, and that's what we signed up for. But you have to keep in mind, like, these are multiple variables in the same equation, which we are thinking in nanoseconds before we make that decision. And so in that respect, it's just for the general public to come along. I won't say the general public, but large contingencies of the public to come along, and these segments to say, you know what, that's it, remove the funding, and we need less police on the streets. If you take a look at any of the major cities in the U.S. as an example, whether that's Boston, Chicago, Baltimore, you're essentially going to see that, where you're going to see that there was a massive spike, New York included, where when they started defunding the police and removing officers from particular beats and precincts, that crime went up. Quite astronomically.
I think the voters made the decision here with this latest municipal election by punting out Kennedy Stewart and the majority of the previous city council. And they were the ones that decided, no, we want to support a city council and mayor who are going to support the police department. So I have a lot of friends who work in the patrol units of VPD. Most of them are visible minorities. And they tell me that the Vancouver Police Department is like probably the most inclusive, respected, supportive law enforcement agency you could probably find in North America. So it's nice to hear this side of the message, because I think that to try and like categorize the VPD in the same category as some of these, militarized law enforcement units in the States is just not fair.
What isn't? You got to keep in mind, and I'm not going to paintbrush any of the departments in the U.S. this way, but at the same time, you have some of the smaller departments in the U.S. where they might have hired candidates that would not be considered suitable by certain thresholds.
Right.
And so in that respect, you're going to have individuals that might not have the same level of training, might not have the same depth and scope of knowledge or expertise to deal with particular situations. And so in that respect, it doesn't matter where you go in the world, policing is policing. And when you boil it down essentially to its fundamental atoms, policing is dealing with people, and having that capacity to interact with people on a daily basis in a very responsible, mature way is extremely important.
I agree, 100%. Kal, you mentioned earlier about, as a police officer, how frustrating it can be to try and do your job and then see the system fail at the court level, right? And as an example, Canada's premier sent a letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau just on Friday, stating that basically this catch and release bail program for talking about the repeat offenders. What is your take on the catch and release bail system that these premiers were writing about?
I'll go back to the day when I was arresting individuals, everyone was going to jail. Because I mean, at the end of the day, it's just the preservation of the public peace and safety was first and paramount to me. But over time, we began to realize that, I mean, there's certain rules, regulations in place where, you know what, we need to be following it to a T. And in that respect, what I'm essentially insinuating is that the Bail Reform Act was there for a reason. Bail Reform Act essentially stipulates once you've identified them and there's no longer any threat to the public, and with respect to there is no fear that there might be a repetition of that offense, then technically by law that person should be released. And mind you, when we'd be arresting them, they'd be released on UTAs anyways, on an undertaking. And
so what's a UTA?
An undertaking. An undertaking is essentially where they are released on conditions. Here are your conditions. Make sure you abide by these. Here's the court date. Away you go. And so they're sent on their way.
I see.
And in that respect, I mean, so we would immediately take that threat off the street, because I was working the downtown east side. The majority of the individuals we were dealing with were remarkably violent. And so, granted, we were going to arrest under those circumstances, and so we'd send them to jail, but subsequently, shortly thereafter, that they'd be released on these UTAs and put back on the streets, and we'd be seeing the same guy later in the afternoon or the next day. And so, but in accordance with the law, that's what the Bail Reform Act essentially stipulated, so we had to make sure that we were operating within those parameters of the law. But with the catch and release program, you have to understand, like, the criminal justice system, there's rules, laws, and regulations in place for a reason. And whether we agree with it or not, when I first got on the job, my recruiting officer asked me, they said, you do understand that you might become remarkably frustrated with the criminal justice system at one point in time. How do you feel about it then? And I essentially explained to them that, and I feel the same way today, is that I'm going to do what's best within my capacity to do the best job possible.
Right.
But I will always remember that I need to operate within those parameters and boundaries, and they're there for a reason.
Yeah.
So just that simple.
That's got to be tough, though.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's in many cases, it can be a bitter pill to swallow, because we've seen violent individuals come back onto the street again and re-engage in these types of violent offenses, putting somebody else's safety at risk. Sure, of course.
Yeah. I mean, Premier Eby has been talking about this recently, that there, I don't remember the stats, but it was something like they did, there's the VPD came out with something saying that there was I don't know, 40 individuals within Vancouver or the downtown east side that accounted for like 6,000 offenses or arrests last year alone. Like it seems to be this very small pool of very repeat offenders who just, and I follow Howard Chow on Twitter, and he's often pointing this out. He's like, we just arrested somebody yesterday who's had 100 convictions in this person's life.
Yeah, the recidivism rate with respect to some of these perpetrators is stupefying, where it's a rotating door, and they're constantly in and out. And I understand exactly what you just said right now, because I would be running into those individuals. Right. When I was in the downtown east side. What is the downtown east side? It's a 6-block radius of some of the most the violent crimes that you'll see in all of North America, considered one of the most dangerous areas. And it was primarily on account of these types of individuals that made it so dangerous, because you literally had these handful of people, handful of perpetrators that'd be constantly engaging in crime.
Kal, let's expand a little bit more for our listeners and viewers on the downtown east side. I have a couple of graphs here from the city of Vancouver, and this is where they do their annual homeless count. Now, I guess because of COVID, they didn't do it the last couple of years, but the latest data was from 2020. And as you can see here, it says in 2020, there was an estimated almost 2,100 people that were identified as being homeless. This is as of March 4th, 2020. About a quarter of them were identified as being unsheltered, and 3/4 as being sheltered. Now, what was also interesting is this map, and as we can see, it's called the Unsheltered Individuals by Homeless Count Areas. So they basically broke it down into 4 areas. So the first one is what I'll just note is West Side Vancouver, so probably from Granville Street west. Only 9% of the homeless population is in that area. The next highest was going to be the downtown core, but not part of the downtown east side, 19%. Then the third category was what's considered east side Vancouver, which is 20%. But amazingly, the downtown east side of this nearly 2,100 people accounted for over 50% of the homeless population. So that's the stats. Those are the fancy looking data and the nice looking graphs. Our map, but that's not the street level view. So for someone who hasn't been down to the downtown east side, I mentioned to you the other day, I drove through there after we spoke, I decided to drive through there, and I couldn't believe how miserable it looked. And I feel like so sad for these people, you know, like these people are living in just complete misery in such a wealthy country. Maybe describe for the listeners and viewers who are not familiar with the Downtown Eastside. They haven't driven down through or walked through there in years.
Yeah.
What is it like today, Kal?
It's in a state of decay. You have dilapidated buildings, broken down area. I remember when I was going through university, I had professors that were talking about a thesis called the Broken Windows thesis. Broken Windows thesis was a thesis that was ratified by a criminologist in the U.S., which spoke about how there is a statistical correlation between broken windows in a neighborhood and the level of crime, because it shows that the neighborhood is in a state of dilapidation and decay. And it stands true no matter where you go in the world, is that when you take a look at these small little red flags, such as these broken windows, it gives credence and water and weight to a theory like the broken windows thesis. And that's essentially what you're looking at the Downtown East Side. It's a broken system down there where I would see these decaying, dilapidated buildings. And you got to keep in mind, there are so many different factors that come into play, which essentially generates the perfect storm, where you've created this environment and atmosphere that self-perpetuates itself. I have been saying for the longest time, even when I was down there, that it made no sense to me whatsoever that all the SROs, which are the single room occupancy buildings, are congregated and congested in one tight area. Why aren't these spread out? They should be. However, you have various neighborhoods throughout the city of Vancouver which are saying, not in my backyard, I'm sorry, right? We're not going to want it here. And so I'm not going to get into that. But at the same time, it made more sense to me, because when you throw everything into one place like that, you're essentially generating that type of atmosphere, those type of conditions. Yeah. And it allows it to flourish and thrive, which once it reaches a certain tipping point of momentum, it's very difficult to change that inertia.
Is this the worst you've seen, the Downtown East Side, or has there been periods before that's worse than this?
It's the worst I've seen.
Worst you've seen?
100%. There is no doubt about that in my mind. Never in my time that I was down there did I see this. Like, I would be walking the beat alone multiple times. Not to suggest that I would change my tactics now by any means. I'm still the same guy. Yeah. I still have the same experience, and I'd have no issues going back into patrol as a beat patrol officer in the Downtown East Side. As a matter of fact, every now and again when I am passing through that area and I have a file that requires me to go talk to one of the agencies down there and so on and so forth, there's still people down there that recognize me. Really? Because I was there long enough. And but there was also that respect there. Yeah. And so I think there was a lot of respect for the old veteran cops that were down there as beat patrol officers, because we were fair. Yeah. We did things in such a way that we knew that we explained that there was a line in the sand that you don't cross. But absolutely, things have gone down. Things have digressed, to put it mildly.
I always like to talk about solutions when we talk about problems, because I think that's the way in which we advance as a community and a society. So, for your take. And I'm not going to try and make it political here, but just what's your take on where are some places that are some easy wins that we can have to make the Downtown East Side better than what it is today?
The general public needs to understand that I won't say the greater majority of the individuals that are down there, but a strong percentage of the individuals that are down there are suffering from mental health issues. Right. So you have these individuals that are suffering from mental health issues, and what are they doing? They're self-prescribing themselves drugs to sustain their drug addiction habits. Then you have the drug economy. Right. So you have the open-air drug market, the illicit drug economy, combined with individuals who are suffering from mental health habits. You have the predatory drug dealers, individuals from different gangs that are operating down there. You have Red Alert, you have UN, you have the Red Scorpions, you have the Brothers Keepers, all these different gangs that are operating down there, vying for territory. So there's a lot of violence that's going on between them for greater territorial control of the area down there. So you have extortions, you have kidnappings, you have shootings, you have stabbings, all this happening there in that small area. Mm-hmm. It was mind-blowing. And so
it's almost like some kind of a Batman movie.
Not a word of a lie. I'm telling you the truth. I would describe it as Gotham City all the time.
Yeah.
And all the supervillains just congregating.
Right. Yeah.
And that's
Just not as glorious and entertaining. It's like real and it's miserable.
Very real, very miserable. As a matter of fact, Stanley Price and Shane Knox were two very high-profile gang members that were operating down there who we were able to pull out that are now part of the KidsPlay family. And so they're speakers for our drug and gang team.
Wow.
But they speak to this all the time of things that they would see on their side of perspective.
Yeah.
Because as law enforcement officers, we can say this was bad.
Yeah.
They'd be telling us all the actual stories too.
Wow.
Of the stuff that was going on down there, where you had people that were kidnapped and tortured for days in their SRO suites for drug debts that they were owing, heads being shaved. There was so much going on down there. And so I don't think the general public was really aware the state of degradation and just...
But it's continuing now.
To continue to what extent, I really don't know,
Yeah.
but it's become more overt and obvious and transparent that there is a significant problem here, which is a manifestation of some of the deeper systemic issues which are down there.
Yeah. On January 31st, so really just a few days from now, BC will be decriminalizing personal possession of small amounts of illegal or illicit drugs. This includes heroin, fentanyl, crack, meth, and MDMA. And as I understand, it's as long as you have 2.5 grams. Was that the number? As long as you have 2.5 grams or less. And as Kieran had pointed out to me before we sat down, he said, the difference of having 2.5 grams of, let's say, cocaine versus fentanyl versus meth it's quite like fentanyl. 2.5 grams of fentanyl is a lot of fentanyl.
That's a lot of fentanyl.
Yeah. What are your views on this decriminalization?
Well, I mean, it's a very precarious position to put myself in because as a community advocate and as somebody that runs KidsPlay versus my role as a police officer. And from a law enforcement perspective, these are the laws that we are binded by. Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly there was wiser minds that prevail, and this type of legislation was ratified, keeping in mind that it was perceived as being one of the solutions to deal with relieving some of the pressures that are on the criminal justice system right now for minor possession. And in the same vein, when small possessions are criminalized, you have more and more individuals that would be using them in secret, which was essentially perpetuating the overdose crisis that's happening in British Columbia right now, but not only here, but all across Canada. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, if their primary objective and purpose was to prevent these overdose rates from further inflating and trying to find some kind of resolution for this issue, then from that perspective alone, it makes complete sense. Mm-hmm. Where something like this was required as some type of intermediary position, intermediary resolution to deal with the issue at this moment in time, whether it turns out to be a Band-Aid solution or whether it turns out to be something more significant later on down the road, hard empirical evidence will need to provide evidence of that.
Yeah, will tell us. Again, going back to these friends of mine who work at the VPD, they've told me that basically nobody's been arresting, say users or addicts with possession for decades. That it's almost like virtue signaling that these politicians are putting this in place, because it's not like people are being criminalized, unlike the early days that you described where you would go and bust a bunch of users. Is that true that a lot of people who are addicts and are just using they're not really being arrested today for having small amounts of drugs in the first place?
Well, I mean, it was discretionary, where officers would come across individuals that might have been in possession of small amounts and might have exercised discretion at that moment in time. That all depended on the officer. But the law dictated that, I mean, if somebody was found in possession and we were in a position to arrest and has satisfied the essential elements of the offense based on the CDSA and the Criminal Code of Canada, then we should be arresting. But you got to keep in mind, it's just with laws being ratified like this, sure, it might be a signal of the times of what's happening right now, and maybe it might be an overt attempt by governments to ensure that we can do something to suppress the overdose issue.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my take on it, Kal, is this is one more way of tying the police hands behind their back, because if you I'm assuming if you're a beat cop in downtown Eastside, you probably know who the users are, and you probably know who the drug pushers are. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So, like, if you can't now arrest a drug pusher because they're sitting with, they're standing there with 2.4 ounces of fentanyl, I mean, to me, it's just like, at least that was an option before, but now that option is not going to be there after January 31st. Is that a fair statement?
But in the same vein, the fact that we do know who the pushers are, there's numerous other strategies from an investigative point of view which we can utilize to put together that investigation, to pursue charges against that individual. They were always our main focus, these predatory drug dealers,
right,
which were preying on the vulnerable segment of society, those that are suffering from drug addiction. Because you got to keep in mind, like, a lot of times, the currency of payment for these low-level users to peddle the drugs for these drug dealers was the drugs. So they'd be paid in drugs. Where
oh, really?
Absolutely.
Oh, interesting.
Where they would make the deals throughout the day, pay off the drug dealer, and then they'd be given X amount of drugs as a form of currency and payment.
Wow.
For their services that they offered that day.
Wow, it's like a Ponzi scheme, almost like a pyramid.
100%. And
wow.
So we would see this quite often. It wasn't the case necessarily for all of them, but quite often we would see that. So in that respect, our focus and objective was always to take these predatory drug dealers out, because what is it at the end of the day? It's organized crime.
Yeah.
When organized crime embeds itself so deeply into the downtown east side that it continues to perpetuate that open air drug market, then that's a significant issue. And the only way we're going to deal with this issue is arresting them, or at least going after their bosses or their pyramid and their hierarchy, versus taking on the small users that are at the street level. If we continue focusing our efforts and resources on the small users at that level, it's essentially the virtual equivalent of shoveling water. We're not getting anywhere.
Right, yeah. Kal, this is a really good segue into talking about organized crime and gangs, because I really wanted to make sure we had to spend some time talking about this, because this is going to help us lead into why you started up KidsPlay. But I know this has been a big part of your work that you've done as a law enforcement officer. One of the things that we talked about was, you know, you've got this vision of like where gangs come from, and you think about places like Compton, or you think about the projects in New York. And these youth that are born and raised in a world of misery. You know, they're broken families. They don't have any money. Nobody has a job. They're around addicts all the time. Like, there's really for a lot of these people, there's no path for them other than, you know, going. And then they get attracted by these gangs, and it might not even be for all the really fancy stuff, but just a way of like surviving in the streets of Compton. As a guy, white guy in a suit would say, I don't know. I mean, I've never been down there, but that's my vision, right?
Absolutely.
What you see on the TV and whatnot. But then you look here in Vancouver and you see these gangs, and it seems like a lot of the people who are part of these gangs, I mean, I can't think of anywhere in Vancouver, maybe other than the downtown east side, where there's people like living in extreme poverty and in like we don't have projects like they have in New York City, right? Like in Queens and Brooklyn. So can you maybe highlight for me like why? But yet we have this huge gang problem here in Vancouver, and every now and then, once every couple of years, it really erupts, and you see shootings all over the place. And unfortunately, sometimes there's bystanders that get affected by this and sometimes killed. So can maybe like highlight why we're seeing this and paint a picture of what the gang environment looks like in Metro Vancouver and how it's different than, say, other places like in LA.
Yeah, what you describe right now would make complete sense if we were to say, from an academic point of view, that granted that those that come from extreme backgrounds of poverty, naturally there's going to be a few outlets that are going to be made available to them which are relatively lucrative and give them an opportunity to find that financial capital base. That, i.e., being that if you have kids that are coming from the Bronx in New York, or you have them coming from the barrios of LA, or the projects in Compton, naturally these kids are going to gravitate towards the drug trade or the gang trade, because that is going to be the most lucrative for them and allows them a form of escape from their poverty. Because they come from remarkable impoverishment and lower socioeconomic backgrounds.
Yeah.
That is the furthest thing from what we're seeing here. It is completely astounding and mind-blowing, because no form of academia would ever be able to theorize that this sort of thing would be possible, where you have kids that are living in the west end of Vancouver that come from multi-million-dollar homes that have been afforded every luxury
West side
and
of
privilege their entire lives, would resort to that lifestyle. But you have to keep in mind, it makes complete sense to me because I have seen it all. And when you rip away the layers and you take a look at essentially what we're looking at, what you're seeing is kids that grew up with instantaneous gratification and a sense of self-entitlement, where everything they did want, they were given. And as a matter of fact, one of the gangsters said, the reason why I became who I did is because I was given everything I wanted in life. And so I never understood the value of hard work or money. You have a gangster
Really?
that says that. And so if you take a look at the Kang brothers, I'm specifically referring to them, where they did operate on the west, not operate, but they were born and raised on the west side of Vancouver, where around the UBC side, where their dad was a land developer. He had done tremendously well for himself. And these guys lived in a multi-million-dollar house on that side, given every luxury.
Was their dad involved in organized crime?
Absolutely not, no. They were afforded every single opportunity in life. And their father was a legit hardworking person that was law-abiding. But these kids were given everything they wanted. So they were going to high school with Beamers and Audis and Range Rovers, and they never had to afford anything or work for it to purchase anything in their life. So in that respect, that's what they grew up with. There's actually a book out by an economist called The Tipping Point, and in it refers to the next generation as the Big Mac Coca-Cola generation. And essentially what he was trying to say is that if you think about it, where with a drive-through at McDonald's, when you're hungry, you order your Big Mac and your Coca-Cola, and within minutes, you have your food, and the hunger's gone. And so essentially, you take that on a broader economic level, where you have these kids that are growing up with instantaneous gratification. They become entitled,
Right.
where when they have received everything that they ever wanted. A friend of mine who's a manager of a luxury auto lot, where he said to me, he goes, Kal, when I was growing up, I might be the manager of this lot now where I'm selling these luxury brands, but when I was growing up, my parents didn't give me anything. Where they said, you want it, you go earn it, as it should be. So he goes, I worked my butt off, and finally I was able to put together enough money that I purchased my first car, which was an '86 Honda Civic. He goes, it was rusted. He goes, there was multiple issues in the car. Upholstery was ripped up. He goes, but I was proud of it because I earned it. And I busted my ass for it. And he goes, I repaired it, renovated it, reupholstered it. He said, I made it look brand new. He goes, but I would cruise down the road and I'd be so proud. And he goes, I kept that for years, and that's what got me through university. And point being is that you have somebody like that understands the value of hard work, sacrifice, commitment, and dedication, and did all the right things and earned it. And today he has achieved a remarkable success in his personal life. But when you have kids that grew up in that kind of lifestyle where they were given everything as kids, and they grew up with that sense of self-entitlement and don't understand the value of money, then a couple of things happens. What normally ends up happening is at some point in time, the parents are saying, hey, we've reached our financial peak. We've given everything that we could to you. And if you want to earn this luxurious lifestyle, which you've continued to live, you're going to have to do it on your own. So these kids are essentially turning to the easiest way to make money, which is the most lucrative and literally money overnight. It's the drug trade. And along with it, you get this romanticized, glorified, scar-faced version of the gangster life, where these guys are going out and using intimidation, tactics, force, and violence to get their way. And they're somehow under this delusion that the respect that we receive for being these high-end gangsters and thugs is legitimate respect, and it's not. And so, unfortunately, they become entrapped in this lifestyle, and the deeper they go into that rabbit hole, the more difficult it is for them to get out.
Right.
And when they're in deep enough and they realize, all right, you know what, I don't see the end of the tunnel anymore. Like, this is it, where there was a lot of gangsters that later on, throughout their gang career, down the road, basically said, I want out, but I know I'll never get out because this is it. I made my bed and I got to sleep in it.
And why can't they get out? Is it because of the money, or is it because like there's people who have got holding something over them now, and or they're just the system is designed to not let them go? I don't understand that.
That's essentially what it is. Like you have somebody like Stan and Shane who are part of the KidsPlay Drug and Gang program. I'll share this with you because they have openly remarked about this as well during some of their presentations. But even they were fearful of their safety when they got out of that lifestyle because of retaliation from those that they were in the gangs with. One of the gangs in particular, their code was that the only way you're leaving this gang is in a coffin.
Wow.
And so having said that, now all of a sudden you step away. But the more important thing is when you step away for the right reasons. You have somebody like Stan and Shane that it wasn't just a matter of them just stepping away to create a better life for themselves, but they also wanted to be assets to the community, where they went out into the public and shared their trials and tribulations and personal struggles so that no other child would follow that trajectory and path and end up falling into that trap. And I'm telling you, it takes a remarkable amount of courage and bravery for them to do what they did, and I am so proud of them.
Well, yeah, I'm sure it would be, and it's probably hard to even imagine. Hard to imagine the life that they were in when they were there and how to get out of that. So this sort of conventional or this stereotypical vision we have of what draws in people, what kind of people get drawn into gangs, is not really reflective of what we're actually seeing here in the Metro Vancouver area. Just to help maybe even parents, like I live on West Side Vancouver, 3 young kids. Pray to God they never get involved in anything like this. But what are some of the signs that can you kind of almost identify like kids who are going to be prone to being drawn into a gang? Like, is there certain telltale signs, like maybe mom and dad aren't really around, or is there certain characteristics that tend to draw in certain types of kids?
Yeah, if these kids are carrying around multiple cell phones and carrying around big wads of cash that you haven't given to them, or they've drawn from any account that would have that kind of cash, you should be asking some big questions.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, but
it seems to me like if you're a parent and you don't see, maybe the biggest problem here is parenting. Maybe that's the problem. Is not parents not like these Kang brothers. I don't know who they are. I've never really heard of them before, but maybe their dad wasn't, their mom weren't involved enough in their lives to even know what was going on.
They weren't. And in many cases, it's a case of willful blindness. It's the ostrich with the head in the sand approach.
The parents want to just ignore it.
You know what? We don't want to know anything about this, right? It's just, as long as you're not creating any trouble for us, you go do what you got to do. And there's massive disconnect. We've noticed where a lot of these kids do end up going into that lifestyle. But mind you, that also segues into a story in particular, which I share all the time when I do present. A good friend of mine who recently passed away, Manny Amar, was a documentary filmmaker. And he ended up shooting the first documentary on South Asian gangsters. And this was quite a while ago. And one of the scenes in that documentary was him visiting a very high-profile South Asian gang member that was at GF Strong at VGH. And for those that don't know, GF Strong is where you go through recovery for very serious injuries. And so the gangster, I'll go by the surname of Bhutar, had been shot in the back and had become a quadriplegic, lost use of his limbs, and he was lying in bed, but he could still talk. And so Manny asked him, he said, at which point in time in your life did you know that you would become a gangster? Was there a turning point that you took this road? Was there a fork in the road?
Yeah.
And he goes, yes, there was. And he tells the following story. He said, I came from a very dysfunctional family. My dad was a drunk. He would constantly beat up us and my mom. There was a lot of domestic abuse at home. And he goes, I was only 12 years old at the time. And he said, I always prayed. I was a good kid. I always prayed that my dad would stop drinking and that there would be peace in the house. Like we would just be like any other regular family. And he said one day there was a coloring competition at his school, an art competition. And he thought to himself, you know what, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to win that coloring competition, and I'm going to bring home the first place prize. I'm going to show it to my dad. In his innocent mind, he's playing the scene out. He said, I'm going to bring home that first place prize. I'm going to show it to my dad, and my dad's going to be so happy, give me a pat on the back, and he's going to say, you know what, I'm so happy. You can ask me anything that you want. He goes, at that moment in time, I'm going to ask him to stop drinking. How innocent was that, right? Like in his mind, he's
12 years old.
He's 12 years old, that this is how he played out the scene, that he believed that if I truly win this, that it will change my circumstances, that my dad will really stop drinking and we'll be a Disney happily ever after family. So he did work hard. And as a matter of fact, he did win. So he won the competition. He came running home with his art piece and his first place prize. His dad was once again lying drunk on the couch. And he comes home and he shakes his dad. He goes, Dad, look, you know what? Here's my art piece. It's hard not to get emotional when I think about the story because no child deserves this. He woke up his dad. He goes, look, I won first place prize. His dad gets up, tears the art piece into multiple pieces and throws it in the kid's face and says, no son of mine will be an artist. He goes, that is when I knew who I was going to become. And you think about it, how many other families this scene plays out? And then we wonder, where did this kid go wrong? And why did they end up on this path? So, I mean, you got extremes on the spectrum, like the Kang brothers that came from all the wealth and privilege and luxury in life, where you have kids like this that grew up in dysfunctional family households where the parent might have been an alcoholic, or there might have been some other dysfunction in the family where the kid ends up following that path. This is why with KidsPlay, and my personal belief system is that early childhood development is so critical and important, is that we can catch them at that age. We really can. And any time we have a large-scale drug and gang presentation or conference, it's not just the kids we're bringing out, it's the parents.
Right.
Because unless you change that environment at home, nothing is going to change.
Yeah, well said, Kal, and great story. Let's talk about KidsPlay, all right, to kind of move a positive spin on this. You started KidsPlay back in 2015. As I said in my intro, you've had over 70,000 youths participate. Maybe start by having the listeners and viewers understand, what is KidsPlay?
Sure, absolutely. So when I first arrived in the Downtown Eastside, as an officer, I think my perspective was very myopic. It's very one-dimensional. It was a conventional way of thinking, and I would look at a lot of these drug addicts as, and I'll say it like I looked at them as junkies. It's just like if they want to quit, they can. Like it was a very limited way of thinking, very short-sighted.
Yeah.
And mind you, I came from a very insulated background, tremendously naive, where I'd never really been exposed to any of this. And it's not until you begin to understand their circumstances that you begin to humanize them. And you begin to understand that, you know what, more can be done to resolve this, especially when it comes to the kids. Once again, I would see a steady stream of young kids that were entering the open-air drug market. They would engage in crime. They got charged, pushed through the criminal justice system, thrown into the youth detention center, and spewed back onto the streets to re-engage in a perpetual cycle of violence, and we'd be at it again. And it goes back to the old anecdote, the tadpole in the well, where I'll share this story, where there was a tadpole in a well living with his parents, and he says to his parents one day, I'm going to go see the world. And the parents are like, yeah, that's a fantastic idea. You go do that. So what does the tadpole do? He swims once around the inside of the well and comes back to his parents and goes, I saw the world and it was absolutely amazing. They said, well, we did the same thing when we were your age. Point being is that had they all stepped out of the well, they would have realized how big the real world is.
Right.
And same thing with these kids that were coming into the Downtown Eastside, that is their well. That's all they've ever known.
Right.
In many cases, multi-generational, where it's one generation of experiencing dysfunction, poverty, and toxicity to the next, and always negative interaction with police. And so these kids that were coming into the Downtown Eastside, once again, we'd be apprehending and pushing them through. I'd be coming to my locker at the end of shift, taking off my uniform, and something just wouldn't sit right. I was thinking to myself, there is so much more that we could be doing, because personally, my personal belief system is that we were part of the problem, definitely not part of the solution. How could this be the solution if all it is law enforcement?
Right.
And we're pushing these kids through the system. Like, what purpose is that serving? Because we'd be arresting them the next day for the same crimes over and
it's
over
obviously
again.
not solving the problem.
Right? Alluding back to what you were saying earlier about the recidivism rates, that it's a small pool of individuals that are constantly re-engaging in the same crimes over and over again. Well, where did these individuals come from? Most likely the kids that were growing up into that lifestyle. And so in that respect, I just thought there's so much more we can be doing. So I had enough. And I was actually driving by a park in East Vancouver one day, and I got an idea. A soccer tournament for inner city kids. You know what? If you think about it, building positive rapport and providing constructive outlets, hopefully we can steer these kids away from a life of drugs, gangs, and crime. So it took me a couple of months to organize the tournament, and I secured about $500 in funding from the department. It was a lot. Trust me. I stretched every dollar. I made it work. But food, equipment, medals, trophies, certificates, all the fun stuff.
Cool.
Right? And so on the day of the tournament, myself and a couple of other officers on our day off, we put on gloves, we cleaned up the field of needles, garbage, and other debris, set up the tables with medals and trophies, and laid out the equipment. And then we waited. And soon a convoy of kids could be seen making their way to the park with raised eyebrows and hardened attitudes. And one of the kids yells out, "Yo, where's the donuts?" I hate to tell him, but
Not in the budget.
we don't do donuts anymore. I'm more of a bagel kind of guy. But the neat thing was, over the course of the day, these hardened attitudes, they melted away. And these kids became kids. These same kids that would have been raising their middle fingers and hurling swear words while riding by on their bikes were now giving us hugs and high fives. Right? So we continued running those soccer tournaments, and they became the successful formula for building KidsPlay. And so that was with the Police Athletic League back in the day. And I just thought, you know what, we need to transplant this program into the broader community so that every child can benefit from this. And so that essentially became the catalyst to create KidsPlay back in 2015, a nonprofit where kids from any background, anywhere, regardless of caste, creed, ethnicity, religion, race, or socioeconomic background, was given an equal opportunity to engage in positive, constructive outlets. But I wanted to predicate it on two main principles. Number one, absolutely free of cost. Up till this date, not one single penny has been charged to any family or kid, because I don't want it to be financially restrictive to any parent that deprives a child of an opportunity.
Yeah.
And so when it's free, there's no excuse.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And secondly, we're completely volunteer-based. Granted, we have a small staff which runs our daily logistics and operations locally, domestically in Canada, across Canada, nationally, I should say, and internationally. So we've spread out now to Colombia, India, and Uganda.
Wow, that's amazing. International operation. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's neat.
Yeah. And so give me a sense. I mean, I'm a financial guy. What's your annual operating budget? How you've got you said how many paid staff?
We have 5 paid staff.
5 paid staff.
And yes, you were absolutely right. It's actually 600 volunteers, and we're hitting 100,000 kids now.
Wow.
Yeah, and so, but we had the chapters that we run across Canada is Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto.
Yeah.
And each has its own different operating budgets.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because Toronto is relatively new, so they're still growing. Calgary is almost on the same scale as us now. They have done tremendously well. As a matter of fact, that's being run by Sergeant Bhavan Dhaliwal, who is a sergeant with the Calgary Police Service down there. And he just received multiple awards recently, one of them being the 20 top Calgarians, and one of them being the Queen's Platinum Jubilee Award. And so he's our leader there. He runs that chapter. He's done tremendously well. He's already got six of the volunteers into police services in that area. I think 1 in Regina, the rest in Calgary, 1 in Saskatoon. And but with locally, we have over 25 volunteers that have become law enforcement officers in Vancouver. 25.
Wow.
Sheriff's Correction Police.
Incredible.
And it is incredible. And
what are the top 3 sports that are that KidsPlay kind of helps kids get into? What's the soccer number one?
Soccer's number one, without a doubt.
Especially now with this team that we've got. Right?
Well, neat story behind that.
Yeah.
So I was selected because we promote soccer so heavily.
Yeah.
Because we also work with the Vancouver Whitecaps.
Yeah.
And our BC Plays our flagship event is the BC Play Stadium Super Soccer Tournament, which we run every single year for kids that come from the inner city school catchment area.
Yeah.
But the neat story behind that is because we're running these kind of programs in the community, the Whitecaps decided to nominate me as community superstar with the MLS Community Superstar program. So what that program was is that one candidate would be selected by each MLS Major League Soccer team across North America, and those candidates would then be flown out to where that championship game was being held. So in my particular case, it was Orlando, Florida. Okay. So I got a chance Karen was with me, who's my president, who's here today. We all went down together to Orlando, Florida to witness this game, which was a super cool experience. But
And what year was this?
Oh my God, this was almost 4 years ago.
Pre-COVID, you were able to have some drinks and not have to wear masks and everything. What an amazing experience that would have been.
It was wild. Yeah. It was absolutely wild. And, even wilder is the fact that I just got back from the World Cup in Qatar. And that's a whole different story. But, that MLS experience was very cool. But point being, what was even cooler is that there was so many other organizations where these candidates had been selected that were with us who were running similar programs in their respective cities. Like soccer became this universal language that they were able to use to connect with their local community. One in particular stood out for me because one of us was going to get chosen to win $10,000 for our charity, $10,000 US. And the running was primarily between me and this other individual. And the other individual was running a soccer program for inner city kids in South Central LA for Hispanic kids. Right. Families that had come over from Mexico that were still transitioning to that life, that were not financially well off. That was extreme poverty. And this guy would take out his time and run these soccer programs for these kids to keep them off the streets, away from the Bloods and the Crips and the gangs. And personally, my fingers were crossed, and so were Karen's for him.
For him, yeah.
Yeah, we wanted him, and he did.
Yeah.
He won, and I was so happy. His mom was with him. I gave her a big hug, and him, and I'm like, you know what? I'm very happy for you guys. As a matter of fact, I think the money is well spent over there.
Yeah.
We would rather have it going over there.
Yeah. Well, neat story. Well, on the topic of money, so if our audience who are listening to you today, Kal, want to support Kids Play, you did mention it's a registered charity.
Yes, we are.
So contributions mean it comes with a charitable receipt.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about what's 2023. What have you guys got planned for this year? And how can people get involved? I'm assuming you also, like you mentioned, you've got over 600 volunteers, so people can not only donate their money, but they can also donate their time.
Yeah, you know what? I always say that I understand that not everybody has the time, but everyone has something to give, whether that's time, talent, or treasure. The smallest contribution can have a significant impact on a life in unimaginable ways. And so absolutely, we have a lot of sponsors who have also said, hey, it's not just money. I also want to give my time. Like I want to be a mentor. And they are. Yeah. So I'll give you an idea of how we're set up. We have 6 streams. So we have the educational stream where we do conferences, forums, presentations in high school. And so we recently had a large-scale drug and gang forum with over 400 people there. And that was in Surrey. And once again, these are all free. Our keynote speakers are our drug and gang team that come out and talk about their personal experiences. And then the second stream is sports. So we work with the BC Lions, the Vancouver Whitecaps, Surrey Eagles, Vancouver Giants, to name some of the few, where we run camps, clinics, or other events, initiatives with them. And once again, these are all free of cost. And tournaments are fun. They're free, and these kids get a chance to play the sport and win lots of prize money and other stuff.
Yeah.
Third is environment. I'm big on environment. We do tree planting with the kids. We've already planted close to 5,000 trees in various municipalities. And so a lot of the kids that haven't had experience with planting a tree, and they get a chance to do this with their parents. We tell the parents to come out as well and partake in that, because we want this to be a family event. And when the parents get a chance to plant a tree with their kid, it means all the world to them, because it not only becomes a great memory, but combined with the fact that they learn something about the environment, climate change, and all that as well. Number 4, our mentorship program. We have specific select elementary schools that we go into on a weekly basis in Surrey, Abbotsford, and Langley, and we connect with the kids there. So we run mentorship program there, bring in keynote speakers, do different sporting activities with the kids, keep them engaged, build positive rapport. And once again, it's that proactive approach that we take to keeping kids on the right track. Number 5, our community patrol program, where we have older kids that are first or second year university with naloxone kits, walking the streets, in key areas within Surrey specifically at this moment, high visibility vests on, and their goal is not only to distribute information pamphlets to the general public, also build a relationship with the local vendors, merchants, businesses, to keep your eyes open for issues that might be going on, such as graffiti. We do street cleanup. We adopt streets as part of that program. We do graffiti cleanup. And we also help out in any way within that community that we can. And a neat program that we started, a new stream, is our counseling program. We have 6 certified counselors that provide free counseling to families in need.
Wow.
So we've identified a lot of families that are coming through our program that need counseling services, and that program has just blown up, where the need was so dire, so deep, and so great that these families are now finally getting the help they need. A part of that program that they've also started running is what's called art therapy. Art therapy is a weekly run program our counselors run, where kids get a chance to come in and engage in positive, constructive outlets to channel their feelings and express them in a positive, constructive way. That program went from 15 kids to over 50 within the span of a couple of months. And the only reason, there's a lineup of about 100 kids waiting, but we can't accommodate them because we don't have the space. Right? So literally, like we are so limited with what we can do. Is there's so many families that are waiting. Because part of our sports program is summer camps and spring camps that we run. Our summer camps, we have over 300 kids just in the Surrey camp alone, and another 200 to 300 in the Abbotsford camp. We run 2 simultaneous summer camps. These are free camps which run for about 3 to 4 weeks and throughout the summer. We would love to grow all our programs, take them to a whole different level. I'm so happy for our international programs. Colombia, these kids came from, when we talk about extreme poverty, these kids came from barrios, extreme poverty, and they would have been on the streets, part of gangs, but our senior coordinator there runs a baseball team with these kids. And so we have them in a league now, and these kids are practicing 7 days a week, playing this league, winning championships. So that's the Columbia program. In Punjab, you have kids that come from different castes, which are part of this program. Several villages within that region that are now part of the Punjab sports program. These kids that had never participated in any organized sports before are now participating in track and field events and winning championships. And Uganda just started a couple of weeks ago, so I'm sure they'll do some marvelous things over there as well.
Yeah, wow, what a great story, Kal. This is amazing. So if people would like to donate, they can simply go to, there's a website, I'm assuming, just go KidsPlayFoundation.com.
Yeah, and great. You know what? I have no issues giving my personal phone number as well. It's 604-619-1064. I'm sure it'll blow up, but I'll just hand the phone to Karen and she can deal with it.
Well, there you go, folks. If you're thinking about a good charity to support this year in 2023, KidsPlay Foundation. Kal Dosanjh, you're the CEO and founder of the foundation. You're also an active member with the Vancouver Police Department in a detective role. And sir, thank you for all the years of service that you've given. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. The work you're doing in our community is amazing. We need more people like you, but we'll take you for sure. And I love the fact that you dressed so sharp for Coastal Front today.
Well, I got to keep up
square
to you.
And everything.
I knew there were some high standards here.
Exactly.
So, you know what? I just want to keep up.
Thank you. Kal Dosanjh, thanks very much for coming on the show.
It was my absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks.